welcome back to this tripartite talk on analog versus digital. Here we are in part 3, the final section. Part 1, of course, was where I chose my 10 iconic turntables of all time, and I here readily admit that it was a little biased towards my experience of growing up in Great Britain. And obviously I'd missed turntables like the Dual, like the Micro Seiki, the Empire. There's a lot of them, but look in the comments. It's been a fantastic journey, and thank you for everyone who commented. In part 2, what did I do? I took the turntable that I chose, the Riga P10, and I expanded the story of how did the Riga and the team go about developing this technology to get it where it is. Now here in part 3, I want to answer the question, can analog, and in particular vinyl, can it ever be better than digital? And of course, some of my people have already commented. One person wrote, no, I've just saved you 30 minutes. Another person said, why are you asking such a stupid question? Analog is always better than digital. So as you can see, there's a lot of opinions around, and I hope in this talk, which is going to be broken into 5 chapters, that I can at least address some of them and we can have an interesting discussion and go from there, and hopefully some conclusions at the end. I'm not going to focus too much on the P10 on this one, except I will talk about my experience there and how far I thought it got to being better or not with digital, but that all comes later. I want to start now with part 1 with just a little overview of basically what is analog and what is digital. Now I know most of you will know, but I think it's useful to have a little recap just to sort of make it clear in everybody's eyes what I'm talking about and what these two terms, which are thrown about so much, really mean. Then obviously in chapter 2, I'm going to look at the dynamics and mastering, the big illusion I call it, and I want to explain what I mean by that. That's a very important part in this story between analog versus digital. And then in chapter 3, I'm going to be looking at capturing the reality. I mean, as a recording engineer, if I want to go out and capture something so it sounds exactly like it did in the studio, how do I do that, and how would that be affected or impacted by analog or digital? That's a real life story about Evelyn Graham. This is going to come up later on in chapter 3. And in chapter 4, I want to come up with what my colleague AJ in London came up with, the emotive connection. How we are emotionally connected to our equipment, whether it be digital or analog, and what impact that has on the enjoyment of music. That's in chapter 4. And in chapter 5, at the end of this video, will be the conclusion, as I say. Okay, so let's get started. So, what is analog? Well, analog, in its purest sense, is the making or forming of a wave which you then somehow reproduce in the same way. So singing into a horn, at the end of the horn's a sharp needle, it cuts a groove in wax, you play the wax disc back, the needle vibrates and the sound comes out of the horn. That's pure analog, 78 records in the earliest days. 1927, I believe, was the first electric microphone, but that's still analog because the singer sings into the microphone's cone vibrates, it has a little coil of wire inside a magnetic field that generates electricity that flows all the way down in the cycle of the moving microphone and the human's voice, and that is recorded or cut straight to a disc, a cutter on a disc, and that cuts the groove. So that's all analog. So an analog can be electronic, it's just not digital, it's not computerized, it's not a series of noughts and ones. So that's analog. So digital, on the other hand, is when you get an analog signal, because everything starts as analog unless it's pure electronic music of some kind. Everything starts as analog. So what they do in digital is that they slice it down 44,100 times a second. Think of a light bulb which we see to be on all the time, but it's flashing on and off at 50 times a second, depending where you live in the world, but we see it as on. But the digital recording is slicing at 44,100 times per per second. And each slice grabs 16 bits of information. Now, in the very beginning, it used to be 14 bits because the guys just down the road from here in Philips and Leuven, they really were the world's advanced DSP engineers and these big mainframe computers where they were doing just this. They were playing with converting an analog signal into a series of ones and zeros, and they worked out that 44.1K was the right amount because 44, you needed 40 to be twice 20,000 hertz because they said, okay, that's the limit of the record or limit to human hearing, so we need to get that. So they went to 44. And the 16-bit they later decided was good for the norm. Now, but 16-bit later on appeared to be not enough, not for playback. For playback, it's fine. But for the recording engineers, they needed a bit more information and they wanted to go in deeper. So 24-bit gave them more width. And the 96K gave them more information to apply filters to or whatever they wanted to do to process that signal. In very much the same way as a 7.5 inches per second tape running past the tape head gave a lot more information than 3.25 or whatever it was. Or now that the Studios run at 30 inches per second, that's a massive amount of information, so that when you want to cut out a little error or something like that, it's very easy, literally, for the engineer to slice a piece of magnetic tape out and join it together because the tiniest of error could still be physically this long. Now, I'm exaggerating and simplifying it, but that's basically the difference between analog and digital, ones and zeros or full circuit. Now, let's move on to probably the most important part of the conversation: dynamics and mastering and this big illusion that I'm talking about. If you go to Wikipedia or any of the forums, you'll soon learn that technically an LP vinyl has a bandwidth of about 60 to 70 decibels, a dynamic range. So the loudest noise and the quietest noise it can capture is supposed to be between 60 and 70 decibels. And the CD is 90 decibels. You say, well, that's 20, that's not much. 20 decibels is a lot. If you don't believe me, listen to some music and turn your amplifier up another 20 decibels, and you'll soon see how much more that is. However, if we're on 96 kilohertz, 24-bit recording, we can get up to probably 120 decibels, which is basically the limit of human hearing. Now, please don't start arguing with this. You can comment as much as you like, but in normal listening, the human hears around 90. But of course, if you're in a very, very quiet location, you can hear the tiniest of whispers. And then, of course, if you're in a hall and somebody whispers, and then the next second, the symphony orchestra blasts out the loudest possible note they could in the end of the Mahler 5, then, yeah, you can have 120 decibels. But that's, the extreme. But the most important thing in this conversation is why the mixing and mastering engineers are not delivering us the dynamic range that we think they are. If you get yourself your smartphone and you download a sound pressure level meter, now we can send you a link to a typical one in the notes, and you set it up, it's not very, very accurate, but it'll give you a good indication. And you put it on the sofa or on the coffee table, put it down somewhere flat in the quietest room in your house, and you will probably find that it's 35, 40, 45, 50 dBs it's constantly at. Even when you can't really hear anything, you'll see it's still flicking away at 30, 35 dB. In this listening room, it's a room within a room, it's damped, it's acoustically, all treated, and we're still getting 35 dB of noise when it's totally silent. Now, this is normal, and this is how it is. So imagine if you're in your car, where it can easily be 70, 80 decibels, 90 decibels at times. Now, if you are a radio station, or if you're someone putting out music and you want it to be played on the radio stations know that most people listen to music in their cars, sometimes at home, in the kitchen, whatever. So there's a lot of background noise, and they are assuming you've got a background noise of 70 decibels at least. So now you've only got a very narrow bandwidth. So there's a lot of people putting out music with a bandwidth of 10 decibels, meaning the difference between the loudest note and the quietest note on that recording is 10 decibels. And if you put on a rock piece of music on your system and you watch your dB meter, you'll see it's not fluctuating much beyond 10. I'm exaggerating, but generally 10, 30 is the absolute max you're likely to get. Now, we've uploaded a recording I did recently for the trio Gilu, and I've made a little video of that. Maybe you've seen it on, how to make a great recording. I mean, how do you go about making these kind of recordings? And what we've done there is, just for you to be able to download and compare, is we've uploaded the original 96K 24-bit output from my recording device. And the post-production engineer, Pierre Nicholas Schmidt, has just panned the singer slightly further in and moved the violin slightly further in from the right, and brought the harp forward just by a little bit of panning. But he's done no EQ and absolutely no compression at all. Now, so we've uploaded that. So if you pay a little fee, sorry, there's a fee, that all goes to the musicians. It doesn't come to us. But if you pay a little fee, you can download that. But you can also download the master file, the one that was used for sending off to Etc. Records for the CD. And you can download the LP file. And if you download them to your equipment, at least you can compare exactly what the mastering for LP compared to the mastering for CD and for uncompressed is. And you'll hear a very, very big difference. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So as you can see, our hi-fi systems, even the more modest ones with the small stand mount loudspeakers, shall we say, and a very simple amplifiers, nothing very high fancy. Most of them I compare like a Volkswagen Golf, shall we say, or Polo. And then some of us have Ferraris, okay? But they all have a dynamic range and capability way beyond the information and music that we're commonly given. So it's a bit like our cars are sitting in a traffic jam where there's no difference between the Ferrari and the Golf. And even when the traffic jam is cleared, most of the time there's a limit to the speed limit of like 120 kilometers an hour or 70 miles an hour or whatever. So we're not nowhere near driving our vehicles anywhere near to their capability. And this is very, very true of hi-fi. And so I want to come on to that in a minute, but I think it's very, very important that you understand that people design the product music and they compress it so it will sound good on a kitchen radio. So, okay, so let's move on to chapter 3, capturing reality. And I want to talk about a musician called Evelyn Graham, and I had the privilege of working with her through the organization YBT, and I did her first CD recording that she ever made for the label YBT. And we said to Evelyn Graham, you can either record in a classic recording studio, or you can record in a chateau in the south of Belgium, beautiful location, but you can sleep there with the team and your colleagues and friends or whatever, and you can work there day and night, working on your pieces until you feel absolutely ready, and then we will just record. But what I want from you is to record each piece in one go. We're not going to do any post-production trickery. We're not going to do editing. We're not going to put in correcting false notes. We're not going to tweak to make the piano different. But we will allow you to travel to all of the piano retailers and distributors in Belgium, contact Steinway if you want, and choose the piano that you love the most, and we'll have that delivered to the castle, and we'll have it set up by Steinway, and then we will record. And that's exactly what she did. And she chose a brand new instrument, and it's very bright, almost metallic sounding. but it gives you the ability to hear all the lovely harmonics that are generated by her playing. Now, Evelyn Graham, I should say, was a childhood prodigy. I mean, I think her first performance with a symphony orchestra is when she was like 6 years old. And at this stage in her career, she'd just finished doing her master's in a university in Germany, music academy in Germany, and she was really at her peak. It was fantastic. She was just full with this music. And she plays on her CD everything from Chopin and Bach, a little bit of Liszt, an absolutely wonderful CD. Now, she didn't want to record the Bach, but we heard her playing while she was warming up. We loved it so much. We said, oh, please, please record the Bach, because we like it so much. It's so unusual how she plays it. It's very, very beautiful. And she was studying a little bit of jazz at the time, and we think there's a little bit of influence there. So anyway, I must go back to the recording. The important thing on this recording is we call it the Balmoral recordings, because that was the name of the chateau in Belgium. Is if we were recording it analog, I would have to say to her, right, play me your loudest passage and play me your quietest passage, and I would want to make sure that it fitted nicely within the bandwidth of analog. And then I'd have to say to her, Evelyn, that's too loud. Don't make your triple 40s quite so loud. Or I'd have to pull the faders back, which is what they used to do in the old days. And they do that in live recordings. You know, when you have a live concert hall from somewhere in Vienna, they will all pull it back for the big crescendos sometimes, or just compress. So we set up the microphones in such a way that when she played the absolute loudest she could physically play, we still weren't peaking. And it meant that we didn't have any limiters switched on or any digital compression whatsoever. But we did choose microphones that could cope with very high dynamic range. In fact, percussion, designed mostly for percussion instruments. And they worked brilliantly in this situation. And because you've got to remember that a piano is actually a percussion instrument. There's a hammer hitting a string. And whether Evelyn is just using her little finger gently touching with the slightest touch a string so you could barely hear it, or whether she's whacking down all 10 fingers with all the strength in her arms, and believe you me, there is strength there where you're playing these massive chords. There's a huge dynamic range, easily 120 dB. So what we did was we captured that, obviously, in 24-bit stereo. And very kindly, she's allowed us to let you download for free a piece of her first track on the CD, which is Chopin's Scherzo number 2 in B flat minor, opus 32, I believe. 31, sorry. So it's such a fantastically dynamically wide range. It will give you an idea. And of course, if you pay a fee, which will go to her and the YBT organization, of course, but for the musicians, all of it will go there. You can then download the complete recording, mastered, uncompressed. But of course, there's lots of uncompressed recordings available if you want them. I just thought you might find that interesting. So in that recording, we managed to capture something. Now with the Gilou recording, and I've just made another video about how I made the Gilou recording, which is harp, soprano and violin. When the soprano, Maria is singing, she can sing extraordinarily loud, and obviously the VU meters are going right over, but we don't let them go into a peak, and we don't let them have to have the limiters. So again, we've uploaded onto the website the full 96K 24-bit master recording straight out of the back of the device. Just pan left and right, and then we've got the CD and we've got the LP, as I said earlier. So this way you can really compare the differences and see how far your systems go. And that recording of Evelyn really wouldn't have been possible in the old days on analog. And even if it was, by the time that it's played on the radio, and her CD is regularly played on Belgian radio, classical music radio stations, they compress it so hard that they compress it right down to like 12 dB, which is, you know, really, really narrow, so that when you're listening to music in your car, it sounds fine. Now, chapter 4, the emotive connection, analog versus digital. Now, when we're looking at analog, and we're looking at vinyl in particular, it reminds me very much of me visiting my Auntie Monica when I was a young boy. I used to go to her house in southeast London, and a beautiful house. And when I arrived in the afternoon, she would say, "Harley, would you like some tea?" Which, of course, I would. And she would then select her favourite teapot. She would bring it down from a high shelf, and then she would start to warm it up and prepare the tea and choose the tea and put it on the trolley with some cake and some biscuits and wheel it into the little afternoon tea room she had. It's a fantastic little house she had there. And we'd sit down, and before I'd even drunk it, this whole ceremony that she had gone through meant that that tea, when I finally tasted it, was just so delicious. And that whole experience. And I think playing LPs is a bit like that, because you come in and you choose out of all your LP collections, you pull one out of its sleeve, and then you take it out of its sleeve, and then you put it on the turntable, and then you wipe it with a cloth, and you turn the amplifier on, and you put the needle in the groove, and you go and sit down. There's a whole process, which means that you're more alert, you're more focused on listening to the music in question. And I think that has a big impact on how we listen. On the other hand, imagine you've been out walking and it's very, very cold, and it's been raining, and you're soaking wet, and you've just been out too long, and you're near a friend's house, and you see their door, and you kind of knock on the door, and you're soaking wet and cold and shivering, and they say, come in, and they take you into their kitchen, nice warm kitchen, and they immediately hand you a mug of tea. Woof, that tea is so delicious. But the process is completely different. And that's, for me, very much like streaming. You've got this idea in your head. Oh, yeah, Ry Cooder, I remember. Yeah, his first album, that was digitally recorded. And you go straight to your iPad, you go dunk, dunk, dunk. And the next second it's playing. And wow. But the great thing about streaming is that when that track's finished, or whenever you've had enough, you will see underneath, other people, when they listen to this track, like this, or have you heard this? And so streaming can be like a journey. You start in one place and you end up somewhere completely different, in completely unknown territory, in a way that before only radio could do. You listened to the radio and you didn't know what they were going to play next. And I think that's the great thing about streaming, and that can be a very emotional thing too. But of course, the quality of streaming is very high quality, because in the old days when we only had vinyl, I mean, when CDs didn't exist, when digital wasn't existing, I used to hate the crackles and the noise and the dust and the dirt, and if someone had scratched my records, it was just an irritation. But now I kind of accept that as kind of being normal, which is a little bit unusual, really. So I really believe that these two processes do influence the way we listen to music. Of course, also, the wonderful thing about vinyl is that when you put that diamond in the groove, it's kind of like a mini miracle. Like, how is it possible you get such an amazing sound by that tiny little mechanical device? There's a mystery to it. And that mystery isn't there for me anyway, when I'm thinking about, the ones and the zeros. That doesn't do it for me, even though I know logically that technically this should sound better. And at least it doesn't make a lot of noise. So I think we have these two elements that keep coming back. So how do I conclude this little talk? I think for me, I need to ask the question, what started this trilogy of videos? What started it? Well, what started it was the fact that I needed a turntable for my listening room here in Belgium. And I was kind of shocked at just how good it sounded. And the amazing thing was, at the same time I was recording my own LP, Gilou, for the thing, which is what I've been talking about earlier. But more importantly, a big pile of LPs arrived in the post about a year ago, maybe longer, from a guy called Mike Lavine in the UK. And he has a company called Chasing the Dragon. And he specializes in making recordings which are directly cut. So he rents Air Studios in London, fills it with a big orchestra, a jazz orchestra or artists or whatever he's recording at the time. And instead of going to magnetic tape or analog of digital recording devices, the output from the mixing desk goes straight to the cutter on the disc. So when you're listening to this LP, for example, this Ella Fitzgerald from performed by Claire Teal, a great singer, with the Sid Lawrence Orchestra. When you listen to this, the record itself, the groove in here, is directly cut from the back of that microphone or the microphones straight to this groove. So when you physically put it on your turntable, and there's a track called I Get a Kick Out of You, when you put it on and you put that needle in that groove, the little bump in that groove, that needle goes over, reads that little bump, that physical bump that was put there in the cutter, and it plays it back. And it would just blew me away because I didn't expect it. Because obviously that little voltage that's generated in that cartridge by the tiniest movement of the coil in the magnetic field is amplified from the amplifier, and it goes straight to the back of our drive cones. Of course, we don't have any crossovers, we don't have any filters or anything in between. It's just directly to the back of the drive cone. So our drive cones are like those microphones in reverse. And when the drummer does in a couple of places on that track, he goes, doo-doo. And it's a little trick they used to do in the 40s when there were dance bands, just to keep everybody awake and give them a kick, literally. The drummer would hit the kick drum and also the toms at the same time in such a tight way that it really, when you're listening to it in our listening, it really hits you in the neck, in the throat, in the chest, and you feel this thing. And I'd never heard that or experienced that in all the digital recordings I've ever heard. But it goes beyond there. I mean, there's a recording he's got here of Vivaldi and Venice, which is not digitally direct cut, funnily enough. But the way he's recorded it, I don't know how to describe it. It's so beautiful. It sounds so real and charming. It's wonderful. So I suggest that you look up this Chasing the Dragon records, because they are amazing. They've got a great selection. But there's also a lot of labels out there doing direct cuts now, and I want to spend the next few months discovering them and finding them and listening and enjoying their music. And I think that's really, really important. So to summarize, I would just like to say, enjoy your music. It doesn't matter. If your passion's for digital, go digital. I mean, I need both. I can't just have one. And that's really, really important for me. The tea ceremony of the record player, that's one thing, but I do need most of the time my CDs and my streaming. Because I've got an entire library at my fingertips. I want to listen to a Beethoven string quartet. I go into a Quobus or whoever, and I've got like 8 or 9 different versions of the same piece, which is incredible. But it doesn't matter for me whether you're listening on a 1950s dance set, on an €800 second-hand system that you half inherited from your parents, or whether you're listening to a €20,000 system or even a €2 million system, a big monster from the 2020s, that doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is whether you're enjoying the experience, whether it satisfies you. And when it does, enjoy it, keep it, and look after it, because I think it's the privilege of living on this planet at this time in history that we can hear and experience recordings that took place decades earlier as if they are there in the room with us. And isn't that amazing? So until the next time, enjoy your music. Bye.